Hello, everyone. This is part one of session 5 of Pre-Socratics to Augustine, also called History of Philosophy 1. We are now kind of turning a page, leaving behind the so-called Pre-Socratics or early Greek philosophers, turning to Plato and Socrates, but we are going to return to the early Greek thinkers any number of times because Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then the Hellenistic philosophers engage with them in a number of ways. So they are going to kind of remain interlocutors for us, but we turn to Plato now. And what we want to discuss today is just one of several famous features of Socrates. Socrates is, whatever else he is, he's Plato's teacher, and he is a figure, an interlocutor in many of the dialogues that Plato is writing. And today I want to talk only about one specific idea, which comes up in Plato's Apology. The Greek word apology means defense, or, a kind of speech that someone gives in their defense. And that is the defense speech in this case that Socrates gives against the charges that ultimately lead to his death sentence. Right now, I want to talk about the idea that sometimes people say that Socrates describes himself as ignorant. And that is a really fundamental and important idea if we think about Socrates, because you might think one of the most noteworthy things about Socrates is that he is not famous really for anything that he wrote or any theory that he put forward. Like if you compare it to, say, Parmenides or Thales or the atomists, they are kind of laying out theories. They are saying, like, this is how the world is, or this is how we ought to think about reality. And Socrates doesn't do that. And it's quite impressive that someone can be such an influential thinker in the tradition, even though he's not doing this. He is continually talking to people, engaging in inquiry, but not actually, putting forward any theories or proposals or anything of that sort. So we want to think a little bit about, how is that even possible? How can it be so influential to not have a view on anything? And, what is then maybe the method of inquiry that could be inspiring and that could be the reason that Socrates is such an influential figure? So in the Apology, Socrates receives or talks about, Plato describes that Socrates received an oracle from the Delphic oracle, which is very, very highly regarded. And the oracle is that no one is wiser than Socrates. And because Socrates is not going to call into question that the Delphic oracle is right, he kind of accepts that as a given. No one is wiser than he is. And that is not interpreted as saying that everyone is equally unwise. Rather, that is kind of just taken to mean that somehow he is wiser than the others, than everyone else. So he takes that as a given because the oracle has to be right. But he also takes as a given what he thinks he knows about himself, namely that he is not wise. So he needs to find out, and that is kind of the kind of framing of at least a longer section of Plato's dialogue, the Apology. He needs to find out how it can possibly fit together that two things are true, which don't obviously fit together, that he is not wise and that he is wiser than everyone else. And in the context of figuring that out, Plato develops a distinction between, on the one hand, a kind of human wisdom, which he ascribes to Socrates, and which is not wisdom about like the big and important things. And you can, what are the big and important things? In a sense, those are just the things that Thales and Parmenides and the atomists were talking about. Like, what are the causes and principles of the universe? What is it that constitutes reality? What is being? What is divinity? Those are like the big, big, big questions. And Socrates doesn't take himself to have a view on this. But that doesn't mean that he couldn't have another kind of wisdom. And Plato calls it a human wisdom. And we'll talk more about, in other sections what that means. And so somehow like the solution of this paradox is that, well, it is possible for him to be wiser than others because he has this human wisdom. And yet not really be wise. And the one thing that I want us to discuss and that I want you to think about for kind of today's puzzle, today's homework question is what Socrates means when he says the following sentence, which is an incredibly famous sentence. He says, "About myself, I knew that I am not knowledgeable about anything." So that is how he formulates this idea that he's not wise. And it's a fairly technical formulation. I'll just say it again. About myself, I knew that I am not knowledgeable about anything. Sometimes if you were to read a kind of intro to skepticism, you might misleadingly find the quote that Socrates says, "I am ignorant." Unfortunately, sometimes the sentence is translated and rendered as if what Socrates was saying was, "I'm ignorant." But more literally, he is saying, "About myself, I knew that I am not knowledgeable about anything." So the homework puzzle for you is, how is it, what does this sentence mean? And here are three options. And the aim is to find a kind of reading or interpretation of the sentence which is compatible with thinking that Socrates, on the one hand, doesn't have answers to any of the big questions about the universe, but on the other hand, has a certain kind of human wisdom which has something to do with how to live and how to educate the young and those kinds of things. So the three options for what the sentence could mean is either it just plainly means I'm ignorant. The second option is that it means about myself, I knew that I'm not an expert in anything. And the third option is about myself, I knew that I'm not a knower or knowledgeable about anything.